Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back once again to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I am the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. We are in the middle of a study on Matthew 24, and in this video, I want to share some more thoughts out of verse 29 with you. Now, I simply want to build upon a theme that we've been developing in the last several videos, and that is the second exodus of Israel. Now, we've shown you that Old Covenant Jerusalem had become spiritual Egypt in the first century. That is Galatians chapter 4 and Revelation 11:8. And they had become the persecutors and the enslavers of God's covenant people, and through their judgment would be the release and the full redemption of the children of God, of the remnant of Old Covenant Israel. And I want to demonstrate that a little bit further by building that upon that theme of the second Exodus from Isaiah chapter 11. Now, what's interesting of Isaiah 11, we're going to go there, is that Isaiah prophesies clearly a second Exodus, and he places it in the context of the first century. And how I'm going to prove that is we're going to go and take out a few different verses in Isaiah 11 and show their first century fulfillment and application in the first century, which means there was in fact a second Exodus taking place in the first century, and that Exodus, would be culminated through the destruction of Egypt, i.e. Old Covenant Israel, which would be the release from bondage of the children of God. Let's do this. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 11, and let's read verse 11 first. Isaiah 11:11. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people, who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. So Isaiah here prophesies the second Exodus, the return, the recovery of the remnant of Israel a second time. But he says it will happen on that day. Well, what day? Well, we can identify that day and that time by the context, like I said, of Isaiah 11. Go back up to Isaiah 11. Let's read verses 1 and 2 and see its fulfillment in the New Testament. Isaiah 11, 1 and 2. Then a shoot will spring forth from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. So when Israel would be recovered a second time, when Israel would experience their second Exodus, a shoot would spring forth from the stem of Jesse, and the Spirit will be poured out upon him. Well, go with me to Luke chapter 4. Let's see this fulfillment in the first century. Luke 4, and let's read verses 16 down to probably 18 here. If my computer will work, we will go there. If not, I'll have to pull out the Bible here and go to Luke chapter 4. Oh, it's slow, but it's working. Luke 4, let's read verses 16 down to 18. And he came to Nazareth, that is Jesus, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the book and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." In verse 21, he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Now, I understand that he was quoting verbatim Isaiah 61, but nonetheless, he was quoting telling his audience that the Spirit of the Lord had been poured out on Messiah, and that Messiah is the shoot from the stem of Jesse of Isaiah 11. So it's also a fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 11. But according to Isaiah 11, when that would happen, when the Spirit would be poured out on the shoot of Jesse, Israel would be regathered, recovered a second time. Their second Exodus would be taking place. Let's look at another text in Isaiah 11. Let's read verses 6 to 7. So on that day, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. Also the cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. So when Israel would be recovered a second time, their second Exodus, this reconciliation, if we can call it, of animal life, of wildlife, would take place. Now, what's interesting about this text is there is a contrast here between clean and unclean animals, wolf and lamb, leopard and young goat, okay? The clean and the unclean would come together, would be united during and at the time of Israel's second Exodus. Well, let's see this fulfillment in Acts chapter 10. Remember Peter's vision, okay? Let's go with me to Acts 10, and let's read verses 9 to 15. On the next day, as they were on their way approaching the city, Peter went up to the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. But he became hungry and was desiring to eat. But while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance. And he saw the sky opened up, and an object like a great sheet came down, lowered by the four corners to the ground. And there were in it all kinds of four-footed animals and crawling creatures of the earth, birds of the air. And a voice came to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, I have never eaten anything holy and unclean." And a voice came to him a second time, "What God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy." This happened 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into the sky. Now we know the story. This vision of Peter represents the bringing in of the Gentiles. These unclean animals represented the unclean Gentiles. So project that and let that be an interpreter of Isaiah chapter 11. See, the unclean lying with the clean, those animals dwelling together represents the Jew and Gentile, the clean and unclean, being brought together in one body and in unity at the time when Israel would be restored a second time, the time of the second Exodus. This is the fulfillment, if we can hear it spiritually, of Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6 and 7. Let's look at another text in Isaiah 11, and this one's powerful. Isaiah 11, verse 12. Watch this. Isaiah 11, verse 10. And in that day, see, this is the day of Israel's second Exodus, when the remnant would be regathered and restored a second time. In that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. Well, that is fulfilled in Romans 15. Okay? The root of Jesse had come, and the Gentiles were being gathered unto this root. Watch this. Romans 15, let's read verses 8 and 9 and then down to 12. "For I say to you that Christ has become a servant to the circumcision on behalf of the truth of God, to confirm or make good the promises given to the fathers, and for the Gentiles to glorify God for his mercy, as it is written," verse 12, "There shall come the root of Jesse, and he who arises to rule over the Gentiles," or the nations, "to him shall the Gentiles hope." So Paul said that this coming of the root of Jesse represented Christ, who had come as a servant to the Jews to confirm the promises. But because that root of Jesse had come, the nations were glorifying God for his mercy to Israel and his extended mercy to them. Paul places the fulfillment of the coming of the root of Jesse in the 1st century. But here's the thing. Isaiah placed the coming of the root of Jesse at the time when Israel will be recovered a second time. Look at the context. I'll read verses 11 to 12 of Isaiah 11. And it will, then in that day, 10 to 11, "Then in that day the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious." That happened. It was fulfilled in Romans chapter 15, like we just saw. And watch this. Look at the next verse. "And then it will happen on that day that the Lord will recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people." You see, this second Exodus, this recovering the second time of the remnant of his people, was taking place in the 1st century. And watch this. Look what he says, where this recovery would take place from. "He will recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people, who will remain from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros," etc. See, Egypt was one of these places of bondage that Israel would be regathered from. And that's exactly what was taking place in Matthew chapter 24. Israel was being called out of Egypt. They were being called out of the old covenant world to enter into Jesus Christ, the new covenant kingdom. And as they were being called out of Egypt, as they were returning and being recovered the second time through their final consummative exodus, Egypt was about to be judged for their persecution and for their enslaving of that covenant people. And as we shall see, just as Isaiah said, They'll come out of Assyria, Egypt, Cush. He also said Shinar. Well, Shinar is Babylon. And guess what? We'll share that next time on Answers on Eschatology. Bye for now.